and welcome to Encouraging Leadership, conversations that mobilize today's women leaders, with your host, Ann Miner. Meet leaders who share their observations, knowledge, insight, and perspectives to mobilize you to apply your own leadership in business and in life. Here's your host, Ann Miner.
Hello and welcome to Encouraging Leadership, conversations to mobilize today's women's leaders. I'm Ann Miner, your host, and I'm so excited today to have with me Beth Horowitz. Beth is the former president and CEO of Amex Canada and a graduate of Cornell University and Harvard Business School. She now sits on corporate and nonprofit boards, including AMIA, HSBC Bank Canada, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Women's Venture Capital Fund, and Catalyst Canada. Beth, welcome.
Thank you, Anne. Pleasure to be with you.
Right, well, let's just jump right in. Beth, and tell us, why are you so passionate about supporting women in achieving their goals?
I suppose I should start a little bit about how I discovered that women actually were being treated differently than men. So it was clear to me from an early age that women and men were not viewed equally when it came to establishing and achieving their life goals. And I grew up in an era when married women were expected to stay home and raise kids. So my mother gave up her job as an executive assistant when she got married. I have no doubt that if she were born a generation later, she would have had a very successful career in business. That said, she and my father did give me and my sister the confidence to pursue our goals, and perhaps it helped that they had no sons, but I never had to be encouraged to lean in, per Sheryl Sandberg. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I was in business school in my 20s that I had more formal exposure to the barriers that women faced in pursuing careers. However, I didn't let that discourage me. And when establishing my career at Amex during the early 1990s, I became one of 5 women who established Amex's first women's network. That still exists today as the Women's Interest Network. So this has been a cause I've supported for many years, continuing to the present day, as you mentioned, Anne, sitting on the Catalyst Canada Advisory Board, and also mentoring many women who are seeking career advice, including how to land their first corporate board seat. And as a member of the International Women's Forum, I was part of a small group that submitted 2 letters in support of the Ontario Securities Commission's Comply or Explain regulation designed to make Toronto Stock Exchange-listed companies more accountable for disclosing their progress against diversity in the boardroom and in senior roles. So I do devote a lot of time to advocating for women, and there are a few reasons that I do this. First, I know that on average, women have much less access to the social and power networks that have helped men advance for many generations. So if I can do my part to encourage and surface talent, I definitely want to do that. And I'll get back to that in a moment. The second major reason is that when business leaders overlook large portions of their talent pool through biases that are often subconscious, we not only inhibit business performance, but we also hurt economic growth and opportunity, as well as international competitiveness for Canada. And that was a point we made in one of our letters to the OSC. So for me, there are both personal and professional reasons for being passionate about advocating for women. Back to the personal side, I have benefited from sponsorship in my own career and now have the privilege of sponsoring some of the women I've met professionally or through mentoring. A fairly recent example was a woman I met at an alumni event a few years ago who asked me to meet her for coffee. Coffee became mentoring, and over the course of time, mentoring developed into sponsorship. And when she completed her executive MBA, I was able to open doors for her that led to interviews and eventually to a job at American Express, where she's doing very well. Before that point, as an immigrant from Ghana, she had multiple barriers to gaining access to opportunities, and I was so glad to be able to help her find the right one. One last point on this is that I'm often asked about the difference between mentoring and sponsorship. A sponsor is much more than a mentor. A mentor provides advice and can coach you on building skills, but your mentor may lack the power and influence to advance your career. A sponsor is well-placed and is influential. The sponsor knows you and your skills well enough to advocate for you and is always looking out for ways to support you, and often in situations and during discussions you're not even aware are occurring. So I often advise women I meet to think about the men and women who have supported them in their career, and if necessary, try to renew those relationships in cases where those past supporters can become active sponsors as they pursue their future goals.
Well, I'm so glad that you explained the difference between mentoring and sponsoring, because that certainly has been sort of an ongoing conversation. I think there's a lack of clarity among women about what the difference really is and how important our sponsorship of others is. Not just those that are coming behind us, but one another, our peer group as well.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I spend a lot of time with peers who are looking at gaining their first corporate board seat.
Yes, and I know I myself have sent you several women, and they've been well guided, encouraged, and supported in their pursuit of that path. And there's more to come, Beth.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure.
So tell us about your own career and a few things that have been key to your success.
Well, I've also mentioned, I've already, I should say, mentioned sponsorship, but both sponsorship and risk-taking have been critical to my career success. So let me back up a bit and start to tell you a little about my upbringing and education, since that's when I really began to think about my path in life. I discovered when I was young that I liked art and history and learning about different cultures. I was raised in a suburb of New York City and fortunate to be exposed to arts and cultural diversity at an early age. But it wasn't until I was 15 during my first trip to Europe with my parents that I had somewhat of an epiphany when I visited the Tower of London. I felt transported to another time, and I was eerily very at home hearing about dramatic events that occurred during the Middle Ages. So that fascination led me to study medieval and Renaissance European history at Cornell University with a minor in art history. So not your typical pre-business path. And after Cornell, I worked in New York at Japan Society, a nonprofit that with programs exploring political, social, cultural, and economic relationships between the U.S. and Japan. And what initially attracted me to Japan Society was the cultural side, an art gallery, a film center, and a performing arts program. But what kept me engaged after a while was the business side. So if you, those of you who can recall the early 1980s, Japan at the time was revolutionizing the auto industry with many, at the time, innovations, including just-in-time inventory, advanced manufacturing techniques, and quality circles. And I discovered that I was interested in what made them so successful when at the same time the North American car industry was struggling with quality issues and competition. I was also becoming interested in marketing since my job involved fundraising and special events. So after a few years, I found myself being recruited for a more senior job at a much larger nonprofit, the American Museum of Natural History, just as I was discovering this growing interest in business. So I was faced with a decision. Did I continue with a career in nonprofit management, or did I make a career change and apply to business school? I did a bit of soul searching, and it led me to the conclusion that it was preferable to work full-time in for-profit, if I could, and do nonprofit in my spare time rather than make a career in nonprofit and try to do for-profit in my spare time, which would have been quite difficult. So that's what led me to apply to business school and attend Harvard. I continued my journey of self-discovery at Harvard, and I credit one of my professors, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, and his course in career management with a lot of insights that led me to American Express. So the course involved essays, working with a partner to explore your past, diagnostic tests, and other exercises. And through those, I realized that I wanted to work at a global customer-focused service company with a strong brand. And I knew that I loved interacting with other highly motivated people. And that led me to a short list. And at the top was American Express, which had a great brand and a dynamic corporate environment. But there was a lot of competition for interviews, just to get an interview to work for American Express, let alone a job. But I did land one. And although I didn't realize it at the time, I was beginning to experience the wonderful power of sponsorship. So let me explain that. While at Japan Society, I worked closely with one of the trustees, Martha Redfield Wallace. She was responsible for the Society's 75th anniversary celebration, and I was paired with her to help her. We forged a great relationship, and she became a great role model for me. She was a pioneering woman corporate director who served on the boards of Chemical Bank, now part of J.P. Morgan Chase, Bristol Myers, and American Express, among others. She taught me how to drive results at the board level of a nonprofit, how to network effectively, make connections, and I saw firsthand how she got things done, selling tables for events, getting renowned speakers, and so on. She really knew how to work a room, and she had a commanding presence. So I can't really say enough about how much I learned from her. She was also willing to give me career advice, and we kept in touch after I entered Harvard. So when I told Martha of my interest in working at Amex after graduation, she helped me get an interview for a much sought-after position as assistant manager in worldwide marketing communications. Now, at the time, I thought I had used my network to get my foot in the door, but now I know in retrospect that I had both a role model and a valuable early sponsor in Martha. Mm-hmm. And, sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going.
Okay, so that's sort of some of the sponsorship, but I'll come back to that again. Once I entered Amex, I also benefited from taking risks, which was the second point I wanted to make. Years ago when I graduated, and I should say decades ago when I graduated from business school, careers at some of the large companies like Procter & Gamble were pretty programmed. You spent time as assistant brand manager, then you got promoted to brand manager, and so on. And that, I have to confess, never appealed to me. At Amex, you could cut a less traditional path if you took initiative, and I was fortunate to do that. And, of course, there was a lot of hard work and long hours and a constant push for driving results, and I learned a tremendous amount from the people I worked for and from my colleagues at all levels of the organization. So the opportunities to learn energized me so much that I eagerly sought them out, and I was willing to take career risks to get them. So, was there a business challenge with no known solution? That was the kind of thing that motivated me and that I volunteered for. Were we starting a new line of business for which we had absolutely no roadmap? Great. I wanted to help create one. Did we have only 1 week to develop a bid strong enough to win a key high-profile partnership over all of our competitors? I wanted to be on that team. So that was always my philosophy, and it opened doors, it created great opportunities, and allowed me to build a personal brand as someone who was up for a challenge and could also drive tangible results. So I learned to take some career risk. But I was also very fortunate to work for someone who became my most important sponsor. And I just want to say a few words because he was so instrumental in my Amex career, and I also learned from him about the art of sponsorship. So I met Jim Cracchiolo, who is now CEO of Ameriprise in the U.S., in the late 1980s when he joined the business unit I was working in at Amex. And at the time, I was responsible for a very successful lending product, and he was recently named the CFO of the business unit. But he had aspirations beyond finance, and soon he negotiated to add responsibility for my product as the general manager while keeping his CFO role. Another example of Amex's flexibility. So I learned a lot from him and was able to teach him a bit about marketing. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship, and I want to stress that many sponsorship relationships can be mutually beneficial. For example, someone in a position to help you in your career, someone senior, may lack, let's say, social media savvy, whereas the person that is being sponsored may have that in abundance. And so, again, it can be mutually beneficial. So while Jim and I parted company in our next roles at Amex, when we went to different subsidiaries, we kept in touch. And a few years later, I was trying to decide between two different Amex opportunities, one working for Jim, and the other, and that was in quality and reengineering, and the other working as head of new product development for consumer lending. Both were equivalent roles. And it was the first time that I met with Amex's current CEO, Ken Chenault, then second in command, to help me decide. So here was the true meaning of sponsorship, meeting with my sponsor's sponsor. Ken, yeah, and that was tremendous. Ken subtly steered me to the reengineering role, and through that I learned so much about the business and change management. So then, just to finish up on sponsorship, I'm going to fast forward to 2002. I'm 17 years into my Amex career, very happily living in London as a senior vice president for international product strategy and development. And then something happened that made me re-examine my life and my priorities. And that was September 11th. Actually, this is still 2001. September 11th, 2001. So I was afflicted with what I call New Yorker's guilt. It was difficult knowing what the city was going through and being in London. So I asked Amex to transfer me back to New York, and they were very accommodating me. After about 6 months, New York was starting to regain its footing, and I got the proverbial tap on the shoulder from Jim, now very senior at Amex. And he asked me if I would be interested in applying for the role of President and CEO of Amex Canada. A true sponsor, he actually saw the opportunity as a great fit for me before I did, and encouraged me to go for it, backed my candidacy amidst considerable competition, and of course it worked out very well for me. So I learned many things from Jim about sponsorship, but I think it's worth mentioning that successful sponsorship requires at least two things. The first is that the sponsor should ideally know the protege's abilities well enough to advocate successfully, and the second is that the sponsor should be in a position of true influence to make things happen. So if there's anybody listening today who's in a position of influence to go beyond mentoring others whom you really believe in, whether it's a man or a woman, I suggest you actively sponsor a few people if you're not already doing so.
Yes, and I second that, because what we often find is that people just don't think of doing it. They could, and they know candidates, but and perhaps I'll acknowledge that maybe this lack of thought, or maybe even reluctance, could reside on the X chromosome.
It may be, yes, and I think it's often people just don't think about it. For some people, it's a natural, organic thing. They may not even realize that they're sponsoring others, and for other people, they may not have thought about it, but if they really are intentional, they may find the opportunity.
Right. Now I have a question for you, Beth, about as we roll back time a little bit. And you mentioned that you were very quick to step forward in situations of risk. And I wondered if you could give our audience some ideas of how did you let your colleagues and your superiors know that you were anxious to have those assignments?
Part of it came from the internal network that I developed at Amex. So, for example, I knew that there was this opportunity to get involved in the creation of a new business unit. And fortunately at that time, Jim, as my sponsor, already knew me and knew I liked opportunities like that. So it was pretty easy to volunteer for that one, I have to say, because he was in charge of it. But, there were other times, for example, when I was at the American Express International Banking subsidiary that has since been sold to Standard Chartered, when it wasn't so clear-cut, I noticed that there was a lack of a product development process within the bank, and that led to operational issues, cost issues, etc. So I raised my hand and said, I am happy to, given my experience doing this in the card business, I am happy to start up a team to develop a new product development process within the bank. And that was readily accepted by management.
Okay, so it sounds like there are kind of two aspects to that. One is having kind of the smoke signals and being able to read where there are opportunities and know, have people keep you in the loop. And the other is your willingness to take the risk and step into the role rather than wait to be chosen. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is fair to say. Sometimes you create opportunities because you see a gap and you know that there can be something of value done that's important to the business. And other times the opportunities come from down high and you just have to raise your hand and hope that you're in the right place at the right time and seen by the right folks. But if you never raise your hand, it won't happen.
Well, exactly. And listeners, that is so important. And Beth, you and I have both heard conversations where women in particular said things like, I didn't see myself as a candidate for that role. It was someone else who picked me. And that passive approach to advancing your career may work for some, but certainly it's an area where we need to encourage our audience to be brave and let it pays to advertise. And
yes,
we're not playing in a merit-based world. We have to, advocate for ourselves and build those relationships.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is to build the relationships, but also to build your credibility by getting results. Whatever it is you're doing, try to do it, go above and beyond so that you get a reputation for getting things done. That way, when you raise your hand, it's a lot easier to get noticed.
Well, exactly. Exactly. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Now, today, you serve on boards, and I would love for you to share with us, how do you add value around the board table?
Okay, so I think part of it comes from knowing the skills that you have and what you have to offer. And as I took a look at my decision, when I left Amex, I knew it was a 3 to 5 year assignment, and so 3 years into the role, I sort of took a step back to ponder what next, and I thought, okay, I'm sitting on several nonprofit boards, which was really by virtue of being in the right place at the right time. In other words, I was a female CEO with visibility, so I was invited to serve on nonprofit boards, and I gained a little bit of experience there. But when I decided to position myself for corporate boards, I really had to take a step back again and say, what do I have to offer? So I knew I had general management experience, I had strategic skills, I had global perspective, some depth in the marketing and strategy areas. So those were the things that made me confident enough to take that step and to sit on boards. But I've also found it incredibly rewarding. From a corporate board perspective, I do very much appreciate the intellectual challenge. I like being able to support senior management in finding solutions, perhaps refining strategy, seeing new opportunities, understanding risk, and also with my fellow directors, help guide management regarding talent processes and succession planning. So I find that very rewarding. On the nonprofit side, one of the things that makes the nonprofit board work so much fun and so motivating is, of course, part of it is the opportunity to give back and support causes you're passionate about. But I've gained another insight from the nonprofit work that I think we can apply to our daily lives, and that is that positive energy fuels and attracts other positive energy, and our outlook can help determine our stress levels and health. So, for example, you can look at what's happening in the world and say there's nothing but bad news, struggling economies, war, terrorism, climate change, etc. But you can also look at the bright spots, the inspirational acts like relief efforts after natural disasters, scientific progress, including renewable energy or stem cell research, and have hope for mankind. So I have concluded that I'm an optimist. And how does this tie back into serving on nonprofit boards? So one of the big benefits and bonuses I have found of doing nonprofit is that I am surrounded by other passionate people with positive energy because they are there doing it because they love it for the most part, not because they see it getting them a big job with more money. It's because they have a passion. So being surrounded by people with positive energy is really a natural high, and it's very contagious. So I would again recommend, if you have the time and the interest, try to get involved with a nonprofit organization that suits your passion so that you can give back, but also just get the benefit of all of the wonderful positive energy you'll find.
Oh, that is a great recommendation, and a great way for those who are thinking of corporate boards to get some exposure and experience of what's involved and the benefits that you've mentioned. Now, Beth, I know that one of the topics that often comes up when we talk about corporate boards is whether you need to be ICD certified. Now, what's your perspective on that?
Yes, I am, and I think it's a good idea, but I think you have to do it for the right reasons. Getting the ICD certification does not guarantee that you'll be on a board. What I tell people is taking the course definitely helps prepare you for a board. There's great content. You'll make a wonderful new network of people who are both aspiring to sit on boards and currently sitting on boards, which is very helpful. And you'll have sort of an extra credential that I think removes an element of perceived risk if you may be up against equivalent candidates who don't have an ICD designation. But it certainly doesn't guarantee that you'll get a board. So you have to go into it with your eyes open.
Exactly. Now, another thing that was suggested in some conversations I've had was that you could take the ICD after you had acquired a board seat. Now, that seems to me to kind of be back to front. What do you think of that idea?
I think if you're fortunate enough to land on a board before you get your ICD, I think it's a great step to take it. I think that 10 years ago, board designations or qualifications were exceedingly rare. They have become much more common, and with emphasis on governance, I wouldn't be surprised if in another 5 or 10 years it becomes the predominant majority of people serving on boards have some sort of certification.
Right. So that's a look into the future, listeners. If you have a desire, a passion, or just an interest in finding out more about corporate boards and what that role would look like, I'm sure that Beth has some suggestions of where you might gather information before you consider diving into the ICD certification. So Beth, where would you send people to get more info?
Well, you can go to the ICD website, of course. I think it's very helpful. It tells about the organization. You can join ICD without sitting on a board or without having attended the course, and you can go to their events. And I think that's another great way to get exposure to people who are currently sitting on boards and to the issues that board members are facing to decide, is this something you want to do?
Great. Terrific. Well, Beth, thank you so very much for spending time with us today Is there a message you'd like to leave with our listeners before we wrap up?
I was fortunate to attend Beyonce's concert last night at the Air Canada Centre. It seems off topic, but her message is really believe in yourself, go forth and do great things, and have confidence.
Well, there you are, listeners. If that doesn't mobilize you, I'm not sure what will. Be sure to join in next week when we'll have another great guest to share more of their perspectives in our conversations to mobilize today's women leaders. In the meantime, be courageous.
Thank you for listening to Encouraging Leadership. To learn more about our host, Ann Miner, and the Acacia Institute, please visit acaciainstitute.com. Join us next week at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, for more Encouraging Leadership. In the meantime, be courageous.